All right, there. Okay, so we're going to try and go over all of the wars in 1 hour. And so that's going to be a lot. I'm not going to give a ton of details. But one reason why going over the wars, I think, is a good way to review is a lot like the artistic movements that we looked at yesterday and how they kind of track bigger like social and cultural trends. Looking at wars will also help us to track a bunch of major political events because the wars tend to be fought about whatever the main driving political issues and ideas are for that time. So we'll see how the wars kind of shift from like religious wars to then like dynastic conflicts, and then finally to like giant nationalist or like ideological conflicts. And it'll also help us keep track of like scientific change because science and technology and war are all very closely related. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up the war document, and feel free to follow along or fill it in or whatever you want to do. That's not it. All right, there. Is that sharing with you guys? Great, cool. Okay, so our unit 1, 1450 to 1648. So the main motives for warfare here tend to be two, and they tend to be closely linked. So one is basically dynastic struggles between families of rulers. And these rulers view war as basically their like personal, it's like a personal issue. They are going to war and sending thousands of people to war to expand their family's control and to secure their family's future. And this is just more or less a normal accepted thing for rulers to do that can be traced all the way back to kind of the feudal tradition where leaders were generally considered to be warriors and war was just a normal thing that rulers did. So one is dynastic competition, especially between the dynastic house of France, which is the Valois, and the dynastic house of Austria and later Spain and the Netherlands and everywhere, the Habsburgs. The second major motive is religious conflict. And we're going to see that with the rise of Protestantism, that a huge number of wars break out as a result of Catholicism trying to put Protestantism back into the box and reunite Europe religiously. And these end up being connected, the dynastic and the religious struggles end up being connected because the Habsburgs come to view themselves as the defenders of Catholicism. As the Holy Roman Emperors, they believe that they get their legitimacy directly from the Pope. So anybody who challenges the Pope is also challenging their claim to universal dominion over all Christians. Oh, we have a fourth participant. Hey, Katie. Oh, wait, did she leave? Oh, well. Oh, no, there she is. Hey, Katie, welcome. We're just getting started on Unit 1 with the wars. Oh, she's not connected to the audio yet. Oh, well. Okay, so those are the major motives, religious and dynastic. The methods of warfare during this time period go through a major shift. It starts out as largely being relying on feudal levies. So the people get the kings get their armies largely from calling upon feudal vassals who fight more or less for free. And this is a cheap way of fighting a war, especially when rulers haven't fully centralized their control over their states. But it's also not a very effective way of fighting war because these armies aren't professional and they aren't coordinated. It's a bunch of random dudes who show up wearing different uniforms with different types of equipment. And so from 1450 to 1648, we're going to see a transition from feudal armies who fight for free to mercenary professional armies. And these mercenaries are going to be very expensive, but they're also going to be very highly trained and effective in using the newest technologies, which the most important change is a shift to mass infantry armies using pokey sticks and gunpowder. So cannons and spears, essentially, rather than dudes on knights with armor. So a major social impact of this So one is that warfare during this time period forces rulers to centralize their control. If rulers cannot tax their citizens effectively, they can't pay for professional mercenary armies, and then they will get conquered, because an army of feudal knights will get defeated pretty much every time by an army of professional foot soldiers with guns. So you're going to see rulers trying to control and tax their citizens much more intensely during this time period. So war drives the creation of states, and then also stronger states drive more intense warfare. So it's a cycle between states and centralization and warfare. Another social impact during this time period is mercenary armies tend to be incredibly destructive. The mercenary armies feed themselves and supply themselves by quote unquote foraging. And what this means is they just go out to the nearby peasant villages and take everything they need. They steal horses, they steal food, they abuse the peasants for fun. And death rates in war tend to be super high, not because that many people actually die in battle, but because peasants will just starve to death after an army moves through their territory, especially if the army is marching through enemy territory. You might as well starve the other guy's peasants to death. Why not? So war is super destructive during this time period, largely because it's not very well organized and there aren't really rules for like how armies march and feed themselves and stuff. And that's going to be super important, especially in the 30 Years' War, where like 1/3 of Germany's population dies of sickness or famine. Okay, so those are the general trends. Questions or comments on general trends of warfare during this time period? All right, so let's go through some important wars. So the first one actually takes place for about 100 years before our time period, and that is the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War is a dynastic conflict between what were the years? The years were like 1320 to 1440. So it's actually more than 100 years. You don't have to know exactly how long it was, but basically for the entirety of the 1300s, France and England were at war with each other. And it wasn't like constant warfare, but it was basically like a series of English attempted invasions of France that happened every like 5 or 6 years. England would send another army over into France and march around and pillage France, and it sucked for both countries. For France, because they ended up losing a lot of their population, and a lot of their like leading noble families ended up losing knights and stuff. And England, because they had to continually tax people more and more heavily to pay for these continued invasions. The main cause for this was a dynastic dispute between the King of England and the King of France. Technically, the English monarch had a claim on the throne because he was connected to the French royal family through intermarriage. And so when one of the kings of France died, the King of England tried to put himself forward as the King of France. And he actually had a pretty substantial legal claim for this, but the nobles of France rejected this and they didn't want to be ruled by an Englishman. So they put forward some other random guy from the French royal family, and they just basically fought to see who would end up as king. So of course the major belligerents here were France and England. There was also a third group who were just random rampaging mercenary armies who didn't fight for either side. It's like the English like paid for mercenaries and then stopped paying them. And these mercenaries just kept being mercenaries and just kept marching around France, pillaging stuff anyway. So that was a whole nother thing. There were just like rampaging bands of soldiers who didn't fight for anybody marching around France during this whole time, which was pretty brutal. So the major impact of the 100 Years' War is two things. One is it essentially breaks the feudal system in both England and in France. And it does this for two reasons. One, for very long campaigns, you can't rely on the feudal system to supply you with soldiers because these guys will only fight for a season. So if you want to fight a multi-year war, you have to pay professional soldiers to do it. So you see the rise of mercenaries begin to replace feudal armies. And second, you see the rise of trained foot soldiers as being more effective than knights. The English, especially with bowmen, and later on the French with cannons, end up being much more effective than the traditional knights of medieval Europe. And one other impact is that this allows France to centralize. Because of this super emergency type situation with the English continually invading France, the French kings are given the legal right to raise taxes on their subjects and to directly tax commoners in their realm. And this is one of the big reasons that France is going to be the first country to emerge as a centralized nation state, is because the French kings are allowed to directly tax every French subject. Oh, except the nobles. But all the poor people have to pay taxes. All right, so that's 100 Years' War. Just stop me if you have any questions. All right, so the next major war that breaks out is the Habsburg-Valois Wars. It's actually a series of wars between France and the Holy Roman Empire. And this is basically from 1500 to 1559. So for about 60 years, France and the Holy Roman Empire fight in Italy. Italy is one of the richest regions in Europe, but it's divided into a bunch of small city-states that can't defend themselves. And when France and the Holy Roman Empire realize this, they begin fighting to control the major city-states. So like, for example, the Habsburgs are going to take over southern Italy, and then France is going to take over Milan, and then the Habsburgs are going to occupy Rome. And so they're basically trying to carve up Italy and take it apart and put it into their separate empires. The major cause is competition between France and Germany to try and control Italy. The main belligerents are France and the Holy Roman Empire. And the major impact here is that the Italian city-states disappear as major international powers, and the Habsburgs come out on top. The Habsburgs actually end up occupying important parts of northern Italy, and they take like one step closer to controlling all of Europe. Oh, one other important impact is that these wars fought by the Holy Roman Empire are happening at the same time as the wars of religion in Germany. And they prevent Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, from focusing on crushing Protestantism. He's so concerned about defeating France that he's actually willing to make peace with the Protestants temporarily in order to secure their support in their wars against France. So because Charles V's attention is split between this dynastic struggle and the religious struggle in Germany, he's not really able to crush Protestantism right at the beginning of things. So if this war hadn't been going on, it's possible that Lutheranism might have just been totally stamped out in the 1500s. Which brings us to our next war, which is the Schmalkaldic War. So this was fought in the 1540s. You don't need to know the exact date, just the 1540s. And the main reason for this is the rise of Protestant German princes in northern Germany, who refused to pay taxes to the church. And so the main belligerents in this are the German princes, Protestant German princes in the north, centered around Saxony and Brandenburg, which is future Prussia. And then in the south, you have the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic German states of Bavaria and some other places, don't worry about it. And so it's essentially a German civil war over religion. And the outcome here is that the Protestant princes are able to put up enough of a fight to win religious toleration in Germany. And this war ends, this struggle ends in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. I'll spell that out. So in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg is signed, which allows for rulers to choose the official religion of their realm. And you can, the king can decide everybody in my realm is Catholic or everybody in my realm is Lutheran. Those are the only two options. Oh, except for Jews. Jews are okay. They can do their thing. but all Christians have to either be Catholic or Lutheran, and it's the king's choice. The 30 Years' War is going to start about a century, not even, 75 years later, when the Habsburgs decide that they are not happy with this settlement and that they want to enforce religious uniformity in Germany. So the 30 Years' War is going to happen when they decide to go back on their word and, that they made in the Peace of Augsburg. All right, and now we're getting to the wars of Philip II. Poor guy. So Philip II is probably has the best starting hand of any king ever. He has infinite amounts of silver flowing into his kingdom that he could have used on literally anything. And what he decides he's going to use it on is he's going to fight as many religious wars as possible simultaneously. And he can do this for basically his entire reign. He is at war in the Mediterranean, in the Netherlands, and against England, all at the same time. And he's largely going to lose, except for this first one. So the first major war of Philip II is the Battle of Lepanto, which is part of that's a battle, but it's part of a larger war between Spain and Turkey. So the Battle of Lepanto, actually I don't remember. I think it might be in the 1560s. Let's look that up. (1571). Okay, yeah. So in 1571, this is the cause here is that the Turks have been expanding through the Mediterranean. They've been building up their empire, or they're building up their navy and taking over Mediterranean islands. And Philip II is worried that if the Turks continue to expand into the Mediterranean, that Turks will begin to take over Christian lands in Southern Europe. Like, you might get Turks taking over Rome, which would be, from a Catholic perspective, terrible. And so Philip II funds the construction of a massive navy in the Mediterranean and joins up with Italians to check Turkish aggression. So the two sides are basically Spain and the Italian city-states versus Turkey. And the outcome here is that the Turkish fleet is soundly defeated and Turkey stops expanding in the Mediterranean. So Philip II's investment here pays off, and he is able to protect the entire southern coast of Europe from Turkish invasion with his defeat of the Turks in the Battle of Lepanto. So that's his basically like one big win. And he does win renown throughout the Christian world for his victory here. This is a major naval victory for Spain, but also just for Christianity, Christendom, as they would call it. Okay, second, we've got the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This is part of a larger ongoing war between Spain and England. This happens in 1588. And the main reason for this is that Queen Elizabeth has taken England back to Protestantism. England has been doing this weird yo-yo thing where they were Catholic and then they turned Protestant under Henry VIII, and then they turned back to being Catholic under Mary I, his daughter. And then when Mary died, Elizabeth took England back to Protestantism. And when England goes back to Protestantism, Philip II decides to invade England and forcibly take them back into Catholicism. So it's a religious struggle. The belligerents here are England and Spain. And England is able to defeat the Spanish Armada. And this has two major impacts. One, it secures Protestantism in England for the future. And two, it cements England's position as a major naval power, which it is going to maintain up until the end of World War II. So the English Navy is now a thing, and it is going to stay a thing for the next 400 years. All right, next we've got the 80 Years' War. So something funny about these wars that are named after years is they actually go in descending order. So we're going to talk about the 100 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, and the 7 Years' War. And that's chronological order. So wars seem to get shorter as technology gets better and armies get more organized. So So the 80 Years' War starts in, let's see, so it ends in 1648. So that means that it must start in 1568. Yes. So it's from 1568 to 1648. And the main thing going on here is the rise of Protestantism, specifically Calvinism, in the Spanish Low Countries. So the Netherlands, as we know them today, were part of the Habsburg inheritance and were ruled by Charles V and then later ruled by Philip II. And Philip II refuses to allow Protestantism in any of his domains. But the Netherlands is right next to Germany and is deeply influenced by German culture. And so Protestant ideas are becoming very influential in the Netherlands. And when the Netherlands begin to convert to Protestantism, Philip II basically infuriates the local population by sending in a Spanish army just to root out and crush Protestants. And he just like arrests people and kicks down doors and, you know, like burns Bibles and stuff, or like, you know, Dutch translations of Bibles and stuff like that. And this causes a massive religious revolt that eventually turns into an organized military resistance against the Spanish. So the belligerents here are the Dutch versus the Spanish. And what the main outcome of this war is it severely weakens Spain, and it results in the emergence of the Netherlands as a major naval power and commercial power in the world. And the reason for this is the Netherlands are able to build a series of forts around their tiny little country, which are super easy to defend. And then they're able to use their navy to basically go after Spain all around the world. And so while Spain is spending huge amounts of money trying to get their army up to the Netherlands, the Netherlands is raiding the Spanish coast, committing acts of piracy in the Spanish Caribbean, and taking over all of the Portuguese colonies in the Indian Ocean, because Portugal is actually part of Spain during this time period. And so this is a huge drain on Spain and a huge boost to the Netherlands, which eventually emerge at the end of this as an officially independent power. All right, and our last war for this unit, and this is really the reason why this war is so important, that it's really the reason why the unit ends in 1648. So the 30 Years' War starts in 1618 and it ends in 1648. The main underlying causes were continuing religious tension between the Habsburgs and the German princes. So the Habsburgs were never satisfied with the Peace of Augsburg, and they wanted to reunify Germany and also centralize control over a newly Catholic Germany. So the goal of taking over Germany and the goal of converting everybody back to Catholicism were connected. And of course, it famously starts with somebody throwing a Spanish an Austrian, sorry, these are the Austrian Habsburgs, throwing an Austrian Habsburg out of a window in the city of Prague. So this war is super complex. And there are actually 3 different stages where different people are fighting. And I'm going to lay out the different stages for you in the belligerents section right now, and you can just copy and paste it. So in stage 1, it is the Austrian Habsburgs versus German Protestants. And that quickly ends with an Austrian victory. So it looks like this war is going to be a very short war where Austria just crushes the Germans and restores Catholicism. However, at this point, Lutheranism has spread to other countries, and Protestants don't want to watch the Catholics take over and like reassert their power over Germany. So in stage 2, it's the Austrian Habsburgs versus versus Denmark. So the King of Denmark is Lutheran, And he is convinced by German Protestants to intervene in the war at the last minute. So he marches down from Denmark into Germany and attacks the Habsburgs and is quickly defeated. The Austrians smack him down too. So Austria is 2 for 2 here. In stage 3, now it looks like Protestantism is on its last legs. Lutheranism is about to be overthrown. This will allow the Austrian Habsburgs to surround the Netherlands and take over the Netherlands too, along with their Spanish buddies. But then you have the intervention of, does anybody remember? You get Sweden. So Sweden, for about 30 years, is a major military power because of the reforms of Gustavus Adolphus. And Sweden comes in and totally messes up the Austrians. They drive the Austrians all the way back into southern Germany and defeat several Austrian armies. However, in stage 4, it's super complicated, huh? The Austrian Habsburgs call in the Spanish Habsburgs. So Spain has one of the most powerful and well-funded and well-trained militaries during this time period. They have spared no expense. Huge quantities of Spanish or of South American silver have been squandered on building a beautiful military. And they're able to smack down Sweden. So now, okay, now you think, okay, the Catholics have won, right? They've defeated every major Protestant principality. They beat the Germans, they've beat the Danes, they've beat the Swedes. There are no other Protestant princes left who could get involved. So what happens is France gets involved instead. Even though France is Catholic, its ruler, or its kind of de facto ruler, Cardinal Richelieu, who is a cardinal in the Catholic Church, believes that France should focus on the state power and building up state power rather than focusing on religion. So France gets involved, having sat there and watched the Habsburgs waste their energy for like 20 years, and then they come in at the last for the last decade of the war and kind of systematically push back the Habsburgs. And by the end, by the 1640s, the Habsburgs are out of money. They can't pay their armies, and France is able to basically win the war. So it's probably the weirdest war I can think of in terms of like how complicated and how many stages there are. And France coming in at the end is just such a delicious twist. You would never expect that. The Habsburgs were probably like, what the heck? That's completely unfair. But so anyway, that's the course of the war. So there's major impacts here. So first, this is the last religious war in Europe. From now on, wars are going to be fought the way France fought this one, which is you are going to calculate state power and make choices based on state power, not on religion. Second, Spain is done. Spain is no longer a major power and is going to slowly lose control of its empire and is eventually just going to become the sidekick of France. Third, the Treaty of Westphalia establishes religious toleration in the Holy Roman Empire, and it establishes sovereignty for the individual German states. So the individual German states are technically still part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they are allowed to tax their own citizens, raise their own armies, and make their own treaties. So essentially, the Holy Roman Empire stops being a thing with the end of this war. And the Habsburgs just give up on trying to control Germany. So, okay, so any questions about Unit 1 wars? I actually realized I forgot an important Unit 1 war, which is the French Wars of Religion. Sorry for forgetting that. But basically, Catholics in France don't like that there are Protestants in France, and they try to get rid of them. But the Protestants succeed and ultimately end up getting their boy on the throne, and they're able to sign the Edict of Nantes, which ensures religious toleration for Protestants in France. No need to go into greater detail than that. Okay, so you guys ready to move on to Unit 2? Okay, so Unit 2, 1648 to 1815. So during this time period, as I just mentioned, the motives for war shift and become pretty much entirely political. The warfare is now about states trying to expand their power, and religion no longer plays a major role. You have Catholics and Protestants allying with each other all the time. Second, during this time period, you see another major transition in how wars are fought and paid for. And the main transition is from mercenary armies to permanent state armies. So standing armies, you could call them. And so instead of mercenary armies who are just random dudes who basically fight for whoever has money, these state armies are actually part of state governments and are run as government bureaucracies. And so this allows for governments to have much greater control over their armies, but is also very expensive because now they have to pay for the armies all the time, not just for when they need the armies. So they actually have standing troops who are training and paid by the government all the time. These guys are also much more influential, or not influential, but reliable. Mercenaries will switch sides or just quit sometimes, but these state armies are generally much more loyal to the state that they belong to. Okay, and the social impact of these changes. So in general, these wars remain incredibly expensive. So you see continued increases in taxation during this time period, to the point where France is taxing people basically as much as they possibly can without driving them into starvation. You also see increasing levels of debt as governments spend more and more on their military. But one positive effect is that because of these professional state-based armies, you actually see the emergence of rules of war, and you see fewer civilian casualties because armies bring their own supplies with them rather than just like killing people and taking their stuff. One last important idea associated with warfare during this time period is the balance of power. And so the idea of balance of power is going to be central in European diplomatic thought, basically for the rest of the class. And the idea arises as a way of trying to contain France. So France is going to emerge as the major superpower during this time period. And the idea of the balance of power is going to emerge as a way of keeping France from taking over the rest of Europe. So that, I guess I'd put that in methods. Or maybe motives, as like, a power-based calculation for when it makes sense to go to war. Okay, so anyway. We've got a number of wars. The first one's kind of boring, and you don't need to know very much about it. But the 9 Years' War is fought in the last bit of the 1600s, and it is Louis XIV's attempt to take over parts of Germany. He wants to expand France into the wealthy German states on the border of, basically on the border between France and Germany. So on the Rhine, the territory of Alsace and Lorraine is going to get conquered during this time period. And so the main cause here is just France is strong and wants to expand. And so the main belligerents during the 9 Years' War is you see France versus pretty much everybody. You see a coalition of powers against France. And this is one of the first times that the concept of balance of power is used. It's the idea that everybody has to team up against France, otherwise France is slowly going to expand and then be too powerful to stop. And so the outcome here is that France is actually largely contained. France does take over some small territories, but at immense cost, and really they don't get that much. So the coalition wins by containing France to very limited gains. All right, so that's the 9 Years' War. Let's skip down to the War of Spanish Succession, even though it's a little bit later. But this is the second major war fought by Louis XIV, and it's basically the exact same thing. This war it ends in 1715, and is the last war fought by Louis XIV. The main cause, again, is France is just trying to expand its power, this time by turning Spain into a Bourbon possession. The King of Spain dies without an heir because he's too inbred to produce children, and France thinks maybe they can put one of Louis XIV's grandkids on the throne of Spain. Everybody else freaks out and says, no way, and you get another battle, which is basically France versus everybody. And the impact here is, again, the same thing. France gets limited gains, but at a massive cost, and is largely contained by the coalition. So Louis XIV's wars, in general, are kind of a failure. Even though he does gain minor territorial advances, he does so at an immense cost and is not able to break out of the containment that the coalition has put him in. So the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession are both massive wars and are both fought because of Louis XIV's attempt to expand France. All right, then you've got the Great Northern War. So this one's really fun. This is where Russia comes onto the scene. The Great Northern War is basically fought at around 1700. You don't need to know the exact date. I don't know the exact date, but just around 1700. And so you can remember that 1700 is the year that Russia comes onto the scene and starts to matter for people throughout Europe. So the main cause is Peter the Great wants Russia to be great. And so Peter the Great just starts a war with Sweden just because. He wants to take over Swedish territory. He wants to build St. Petersburg. So he just attacks Sweden. And the war is fought between Russia and Sweden. And the major impact here is that Russia is able to defeat Sweden and is able to emerge as a major modern state with a modern military. So basically, this is the war that makes Russia a thing. Famously, Louis XIV didn't know who the Tsar of Russia was during his reign. He sent letters to the wrong person several times. That's how unimportant Russia was before the Great Northern War. All right, now we've got another war of succession. These next two wars are the wars that make Prussia. So up until this time, the major powers have been England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire / Austria. Now, with these wars, we're seeing Russia and Prussia come onto the scene as major powers. So the War of Austrian Succession is fought in the 1740s. Don't need to know the exact date, just the 1740s. And the main cause here is that Prussia starts a war with Austria in order to gain territory. And they do this at a time when Austria is going through a transition from one leader to another. So they attack at a period of instability and are able to occupy and take over a very powerful and important part of Austria, specifically the province of Silesia. You don't need to know that. So the war involves actually a set of alliances. And so on the one hand, you have Prussia and France, and then on the other hand, you have Austria and Britain. And one thing that happens that's really important here is France actually backs Prussia all the way, because France hates Austria. They've been rivals for hundreds of years. And so France backs Prussia all the way, and with French help, Prussia is able to smack down Austria no problem. Britain, on the other hand, basically does nothing. They just let Austria go and give Austria some money. And Austria, because Britain doesn't get involved, suffers a major defeat and is forced to give Prussia one of its most valuable provinces. So the impact here is a couple things. The most important one is that Prussia emerges as a major power as the result of this war. It shows off its military capabilities, and it basically doubles its population by taking over this very important province. Second, you get the diplomatic revolution, which is a switch in the alliance system. Austria and France basically make up, and Austria allies with France as a way of trying to take over Prussia. And that means that, so France and Austria, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, who had been at war since the beginning of the class, are now buddies. And they're going to be buddies until the French Revolution. All right, next major war is the 7 Years' War, which actually lasts for 9 years. It's fought from 1751 to 1763, I believe. Not 100% sure, actually. But it ends in 1763. The major cause of this war is two separate things. One is British and French competition for colonies in India and North America. In the United States, this war is known as the French and Indian War because one of the major theaters of the war was in colonial America. Famously, the very first hostilities of this war were fought by George Washington, who attempted to attack a French fort somewhere in Ohio and failed disastrously. That was George Washington's first major military command. And the second major cause of this war is Austrian revenge against Prussia. So Austria wants to take back what Prussia took from it. In the War of Austrian Succession. So on the one side you get France and Austria and Russia versus Prussia and Britain. And so this doesn't look very good for Prussia because Britain's not really going to supply it with very much stuff, and Prussia basically has to fight France, Austria, and Russia all at once. So it's fighting a three-front war. Kind of miraculously, Prussia is able to survive by fighting a series of very brilliant defensive battles and wait until Russia does something stupid, which is just quit the war for no reason. So the major impact here is a couple things. So first of all, Prussia survives. That's probably the number one thing. Prussia could have disappeared if this war had gone differently. And then, of course, if we hadn't had Prussia, we wouldn't have had Germany, and then we wouldn't have had the Nazis. So this is a crazy and important thing that happens here. Second, and maybe just as important, is the British Empire is able to take over all of the French territories pretty much everywhere in the world, except for Haiti. But Britain takes over Louisiana. Britain takes over Canada. And Britain takes over India, all of which France had been major French colonies beforehand. And third, this war leads to massive amounts of debt for France. France loses this war and gets basically nothing out of it, loses its major colonies, and has to then pay the bills afterwards. So this is one of the major causes of the French Revolution. Okay, these next two I'm going to go through really fast because they're not super important. I just want you to know that they're happening. From 1770 till 1800, Russia is at war with Turkey, and they're just taking over Turkish territory. And at this point, Russia is way stronger than Turkey, so they can just basically beat up on the Turks and take whatever they want. So it's Russia versus Turkey. The main impact is that Russia wins and takes over a bunch of Turkish territory. It expands kind of south and also east into the Balkans. Next, you might not think of this as a European war because it mostly just involves America, but it actually is largely part of a larger global struggle between France and Britain. So, gosh, when does the American Revolution actually end? Is it like 1784? 1780, I don't know. Let's look it up. I think it's 1780 something. 83, okay. So from 1775 to 1783, this is going on. The major cause is rich white people in America don't want to pay taxes, which is a constant theme in American history. But the major belligerents are it's actually France versus Britain. Most of the money for the revolution is coming from France. France supplies pretty much the entire navy and also supplies professional armies to America. So this is like a sequel to the 7 Years' War, where France is trying to get revenge on Britain for having lost all of their colonial territories. And the major impact for European history is that this is the last straw that breaks the camel's back for France. The debt from this war is so massive that France cannot pay it off, and it has to eventually attempt to reform their tax structure, which leads to the Estates General and the National Assembly and all of that stuff. The loss of the American colonies actually isn't that bad for Britain, because Britain still remains the major trading partner of the colonies. So they actually still get most of the benefits of having the colonies, but they don't have to pay for armies anymore. So it's not actually a big deal for Britain, which is kind of weird. That's one reason why America was able to win, is Britain realized that it didn't matter that much, and it might actually be more expensive to fight to keep the colonies than to just give them away and then trade with them. All right, so the French Revolutionary Wars, this is a huge thing that I don't really want to go into the details on. But basically, it lasts from 1791 to 1815. And it starts with the French Republic, and then it goes through Napoleon, and then Napoleon comes back again. So basically for 25 years, there's constant brutal warfare going on throughout Europe because of the French Revolution. The causes, obviously, are the French Revolution, and that conservative rulers do not want to allow a revolutionary state to exist in Europe. They are afraid that the ideas of the French Revolution could spread and cause revolutions in their territories as well. So the belligerents in this war is basically France versus everybody. At various points, France is able to force other countries to ally with it, but these are temporary alliances, and as soon as things go bad for France, they all re-ally against France. So it'd be France versus Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, everybody. There's a couple major impacts of this. First, in spite of the glory of Napoleon, France loses. France is ultimately defeated, and this is France's last shot to become a major superpower. When France is defeated in the French Revolutionary Wars, France is contained and is going to begin to fall behind both Britain and Germany as a major power. So this is kind of like France's last hurrah. Second, revolutionary ideas spread to all of the other countries in Europe. Even though France loses, the French armies kind of sow the seeds of future revolutions everywhere that they go, spreading ideas and slogans, and also just showing that revolutions are possible and that revolutionary governments are powerful. This is kind of like second reason 2.5. One of the key ideas that is spread by the French Revolution is nationalism. There's an increasing sense that states should represent the people of a region. And the question then is, who is the people? And the answer that pretty much everybody comes up with and eventually begins to believe in is that people are divided naturally up into different nations, and that these nations should determine the states. So there's a shift away from dynastic politics where families rule territories, and a shift towards this belief that nations are the real people who should be making decisions. Yeah, it's kind of hard to have a democracy without also a concept of who belongs within the democracy, and nations supply that idea. Okay, and Unit 3. This one's actually pretty short, and I'm going to go kind of fast to try and stay within our time limit. So in Unit 3, we see balance of power and kind of like rational Machiavellian calculations they stay as a motive. But another really important motive arises, and that is nationalism. Nationalism causes wars in Unit 3, kind of in the way that religion causes wars in Unit 1. In Unit 1, the main identity that people had, if you ask somebody, who are you, what's your deal? They would have identified as a Protestant or a Catholic. In Unit 3, if you ask somebody who you are, what your deal is, they'll very quickly identify themselves as a Frenchman or an Englishman or an Irishman or whatever. And so nations have become the key identifying factor for people and have also become a key motive in getting people to fight. And third is imperialism. Imperial competition between countries becomes a major motive that is eventually going to drive conflict and lead to World War I. Okay, so the methods for this time period is you see increasingly industrial warfare. And so I would write something like applying industrial technology to warfare. And this leads to better rifles, better and more advanced artillery, but also the use of railroads and eventually by World War I, all sorts of crazy industrial technology. But basically they realized that the Industrial Revolution is crucial to military success. If you want to win wars, you have to also have access to industrial technology. And this is made super clear in the Crimean War, which we'll look at in just a second. The social impact of these wars, I don't know if I can generalize really about what the social impacts will be. So we'll just talk about the impacts in case-by-case basis. Okay, Greek War of Independence, 1820. The Greeks break away from the Turks, and countries from all over Europe decide they want to help Greece because Greece is European and Turkey is not. So they all get involved and they help Greece, basically just because of identity. They're just like, yeah, Greece shouldn't be ruled by savage Oriental people. Greece should be ruled by European people. And Greece actually ends up with a German king, which doesn't make any sense. But so you're starting to see kind of this like European identity forming around concepts of like progress and like rationality and stuff. And that then applies to the Greek revolt. Also, Greek nationalism. The Greeks had decided that they were a different people from the Turks. And the impact is that this weakens Turkey. All right. The revolutions of 1830, they happen in 1830. The main cause here is two things. One is liberalism, and the other is nationalism. And basically, during the revolutions of 1830, the bourgeoisie in other countries, want more power. They want more of the French Revolutionary type reforms. And they also sometimes want to be separate from larger multinational empires. And so you see revolutions in a number of countries. And so I'll just list them here and you can copy them. But so in Belgium, you see liberalism and nationalism. In Poland, you see nationalism. In Italy, you see nationalism. And they pretty much all fail. I don't want to talk about impact here. Okay, the Opium Wars is an imperial war fought by Britain against China. These, there are two. One happens in the 1830s and one happens in the 1860s. The main cause here is that China is trying to regulate its trade, and Britain doesn't want it to regulate its trade because it wants to sell drugs to China, specifically opium. The belligerents are China versus Britain. And the impact here is that Britain basically uses military force to require China to adopt harmful trade policies. They basically require China to legalize opium and then to massively import opium from Britain. So this is a boost to the British economy because they can make huge amounts of money and fix their trade balance with China. And it is a huge cost to China and is ultimately going to destabilize China and bring about the Chinese revolution in the early 20th century. In the revolutions of 1848, you see a number of nationalist revolts. The major revolts happen in these countries that I'm going to list. Basically every country except Britain And so in all of these, so in France, this succeeds, but quickly turns into a dictatorship. And this is where Louis Napoleon comes into power. In Prussia, it fails, and it gets crushed by conservative kings. And in Austria, it fails, and it gets crushed by conservative kings. Specifically, Russia goes into Austria and crushes the revolt for Austria. So the major impact here is the failure of the revolutions and the success of conservative monarchs. So in the early 19th century, this was the age of romanticism. People had high hopes. People thought that you could just have a revolt and change the world. Kind of like the hippies thought that just by like being weird and having some protests, they could change American culture forever. Didn't work. And so this represents kind of the end of the revolutionary era and is going to bring about a more conservative era in which conservative elites try to harness nationalism for their own ends now that the revolutionary idea has kind of failed. So let's see, we've got the Crimean War, the Sepoy Rebellion, the Wars of Italian Unification, the Austro-Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Boer War. Oh man, so many wars. Okay guys, so what do you think? Should we stop or do you want to keep going? Should we take a break? Because I know we were only supposed to go till 12, but I really don't have anything else to do right now. So I could just keep talking to you about 19th century wars. How you feeling? Let me know what you think.
I'm fine with anything.
Sorry?
I'm fine with anything.
Okay, no preference?
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me either.
Good either way.
Well, I guess we should just finish it then. That seems more efficient to me. Geez, if I put this on YouTube, it's definitely going to go viral. People love hour-and-a-half long lectures where you just look at a Word document. Okay. Sweet. Any questions before we plunge forward into late 19th century warfare? Okay. Hang on, let me get a sip of tea. Okay. So the Crimean War is fought in the early 1850s. I think it ends in 1853. And the causes of the Crimean War is because of international balance of power. Russia is trying to take over Turkey and extend its influence into the Mediterranean by taking over Constantinople. The Western European powers do not want Russia to do this. They worry that if Russia does this, that it will be way too powerful and it will be able to block British trade through the Middle East to India. So Britain and France ally against Russia in order to prevent Russia from taking over Turkey. The main belligerents are Britain, France, and Turkey versus Russia. The impact here is that Britain and France are able to crush Russia easily. And the reason for that is that Britain and France have industrialized and Russia has not. So it's actually easier and faster for Britain and France using industrial technology to deploy an army in Russia than it is for Russia to deploy an army in Russia. Using steamships and modern communication technologies, Britain and France are able to deploy and set up and take over key Russian forts before Russia is able to get their boys down there because they're still using horses and wagons. And it's just not going to work. So the key impact for the Crimean War is that Russia realizes that it has to modernize. And so Russia is going to try and modernize super rapidly. And what this is going to do is it's going to lead to a period of high instability in Russia that is ultimately going to end with the Russian Revolution. Okay, the next one. This is one that we didn't really focus on in class, but it's very important. The Sepoy Rebellion. So the Sepoy Rebellion is a massive mutiny, or maybe a rebellion, or some people call it a war for independence in India. So the Sepoys were a group of professional Indian soldiers trained by the British East India Company to do the East India Company's bidding. For various reasons, the Sepoys rebel against the British East India Company and take over large parts of India. This requires then the British to deploy their own professional military to India to restore control of India. They then crush the rebellion, crush any independent Indian princes, and force them all to officially join the British Empire. And this is where the British East India Company disappears, and Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India. She actually travels to India to be crowned the Empress of India there. So a major impact here, it just kind of signifies kind of the emergence of the peak British Empire. So from the 1850s till 1945, Britain is going to be a major power throughout the world and is going to dominate India specifically. Okay, so next we've got the Wars of Unification. So a lot of these rebellions and revolutions tried to create unified nation states. The German revolutions of 1848 tried to create an independent Germany. The Polish revolutions tried to create an independent Poland, and these failed. So leaders now are realizing that there is a popular demand for nation states, and they try to harness this nationalism in order to put themselves in charge. So what we're going to see is we're going to see the emergence of a number of conservative nation states as a result of limited warfare. And so the first country to do this is Italy. And this takes place in the 1860s. Don't worry about the specific years, just the 1860s. And the main causes of this are Italian national sentiment, and also brilliant strategic planning by Piedmont Sardinia, which is the Italian state that plans this whole thing. The main statesman behind the whole thing is Camillo Cavour. And so in the Wars of Italian Unification, you see Italy and France take on Austria. Austria is the main thing blocking Italian unification because Austria actually controls Milan and Venice and a number of other important Italian states. So in order to unify Italy, Italy's going to have to go up against Austria. Italy knows that it can't beat Austria one-on-one because Italians aren't very good at fighting. I don't know why. Haven't been since the Roman Empire. So what they do is they get France to fight Austria for them. And so France agrees to fight Austria for Italy in order to create an independent Italian state, and this works. So the result of this is you get the emergence of a unified Italian state. However, Italy remains culturally very divided. Italy is not really a nation in any meaningful sense of the word. There's different dialects, completely different cultures, and very little transportation between northern and southern Italy. So what you get is a very weak and very corrupt Italian state that emerges as the result of these wars. Italy is officially considered to be a great power, but that's mostly just to be polite. Now, Germany, or rather Prussia, sees this and recognizes that this is also a possibility for Germany. And Germany is, in many ways, actually a nation. They have a shared language. They have a shared political history with the Holy Roman Empire. And so there are many reasons to think that Germany could be a very successful nation. They also are the largest ethnic group in Europe, other than Russians. So there's like millions and millions and millions of Germans living in a bunch of stupid little tiny states that don't make any sense. And so Prussia recognizes that there is a huge opportunity here to emerge as a major power by unifying the various German states. So how this happens is Otto von Bismarck engineers a series of wars in order to delegitimize any of the other major powers in the region and to convince the smaller German states that the future of Germany lies with Prussia. If they want to be part of something great, Prussia is the state to be with. And so he does this by demonstrating Prussian power by absolutely crushing first Austria and then France. So the Austro-Prussian War happens in 1866, and it is over in 3 weeks. The major reason that this happens is that Otto von Bismarck is able to engineer basically an insult to Austria and to convince Austria to attack Prussia. Prussia is then completely ready for this and immediately invades Austria and destroys their main army in a single huge battle and emerges victorious, almost unscathed. So the major impact of the Austro-Prussian War is that Prussia is able to convince all of the Protestant German states of northern Germany to join with Prussia into a new state known as the Northern German Confederation. So this expands, this basically doubles Prussia's size by incorporating various states like Brunswick and Hanover and Schleswig and other places like that. Now, the main thing still standing in the way of the creation of a unified German state is France. For a long time, Catholic states of southern Germany had looked to Austria for protection because Austria was the traditional defender of Catholicism. Now the Catholic states look to France, and France says that it is going to guarantee the independence of the Catholic German southern states of Bavaria and Baden and Württemberg and a couple other places. So in order to get those countries to change sides and join Germany, Germany first has to show everybody that France cannot stand up to Prussia. And so Prussia engineers a war with France. Oh, this, by the way, is in 1870. And engineers a war with France, and then immediately invades and crushes France in like a couple months. And the main impact of this is France is humiliated, and France develops a lasting hatred for Prussia that is going to continue into World War I. Second, this results in the emergence of the German Empire, which becomes the largest economy and the largest military in Europe. So this is where Germany comes onto the stage, and they look very scary. This is going to totally upset the balance of power. And whereas before people were worried about France taking over the continent, now people are afraid about Germany taking over the continent. So that's the Franco-Prussian War. And all right, we got 2 more wars and then we're done. So next up, we've got the Boer War. The Boer War is another imperial war fought by Great Britain. So you'll notice that during this time period, Britain is really not involved with many of these wars on the continent. Britain is instead taking over the rest of the world. So they fight the Opium Wars in China, they fight against the Sepoy Mutiny in India, and now in South Africa, they fight something known as the Boer War. So the Boer War was fought in the late 1800s, like the 1890s. And basically what's happening here is there was before the British took over South Africa, there were Dutch settlers there. And these Dutch settlers had lived there for hundreds of years, kind of on the coast. And when the British came in and started taking over the coast, the Boers actually moved into the interior of South Africa and set up a free state there where they kind of did their own thing. And later, as Britain began to move into the interior of South Africa, the Boers attempted to resist them and did so very successfully because they knew the territory, they knew the local conditions, and were very skilled horsemen. So basically, these random Dutch guys living in Africa were able to run circles around the British army for a number of years. And this war became incredibly expensive and made Britain look really bad, because the only way that Britain was able to win this war was by rounding up all of the Boers and putting them in concentration camps, which they did until the Boer army was completely defeated. And this kind of made Britain look bad internationally. Germany made fun of them and like pointed out that, you know, Britain was behaving kind of like an evil empire or whatever. And it also cost Britain a lot of money to deal with this. it's not the most important war, but it is important to keep in mind that Britain's focus is primarily overseas during this time period, trying to expand and control its imperial holdings elsewhere. And then last of all, we have the Balkan Wars. These happen basically from like 1900 to 1912, just kind of on and off, different tensions in the Balkans. It's these conflicts that make, it's conflicts like these that make Bismarck say that the next war is going to be caused by the Balkans. And basically what's happening is two things. The Ottoman Empire is too weak to control the Balkan states. And the Balkan states are divided up into a bunch of different conflicting nationalities. There's Serbs and Romanians and Croats and Macedonians and Greeks and Ukrainians and Bulgarians, and they all think that they deserve to start a major powerful nation state in the Balkans. On top of that, Russia thinks that it should just take over all of them because they're all Slavic, mostly, except for the Romanians, and control all of them. And on top of that, Austria thinks that it should control all of them just because it wants to. So there's this major conflict of dynastic and imperial ambitions and nationalist ambitions. So it's just all of the different factors that can cause wars during this time period mixed into a big soup of possible conflict. And so basically, the people who end up fighting in these Balkan wars are just all of the new nation states that emerge in the Balkans. So Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, you know, so on, Bosnia. But so anyway, the main impact of this is it leads to increasing tension between Austria and Russia. Both Austria and Russia believe that they deserve to be in charge of this region, and neither of them is willing to back down. So rather than back down, they're willing to risk a massive escalation of conflict in the region, which is ultimately going to lead to the outbreak of war in 1914. All right, and we don't actually have to talk about World War I because that's not going to be on your test. So those are all the wars that you need to know. So hopefully that was a good refresher and that reminded you of some stuff that you had forgotten about. How you guys doing? Any questions? Anything you want to talk about before we go? I guess that's a no then, huh? All right, cool. Well, here, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.